Hello everyone, hope that you all are doing great. I have just started my YouTube channel and I upload videos related to Java Spring Boot applications, and in future I'll be coming up with some idea based projects. The live coding of those projects would be done on my YouTube videos. So people who are interested in such kind of videos and would like to learn more on coding on Spring Boot, do subscribe to the channel. So in the past I have made videos of Spring Boot Hello World example and Spring Boot application to establish connection with the database, both with MySQL and Postgres. So if you haven't watched those videos, the link would be in the description, do watch it. So today in this video we will be learning to make a CRUD application in Spring Boot. So as in CRUD application we will be interacting with the Postgres database as we did in the previous video. So all the Maven dependency remain the same as we used in the previous video. So if you need more on that, you can first go and check the previous video of Spring Boot application with Postgres, and then you can switch to this video. So I will directly take you to the project structure that we made in the previous video. So let's go to the IDE, and we can see that this was our project structure which was previously made in the video of Spring Boot application with PostgreSQL. So this was our main class, this was controller, this was employee entity that we were storing, and this is employee repo. So here we have already made one endpoint in the previous video that was to save the data, right? So in the CRUD, what CRUD stands for is, CRUD stands for C is for create, that is saving the data. Then R is for read, that is for finding the data, searching the data into the database. And then U stands for update and D stands for delete. So we'll be making as save endpoint is already been made, that is the create endpoint. So we'll be making, now we'll start making the endpoint of find. So find can be done by two ways. First is that we can find the data by the ID. If we are supplied the ID, and we can go to the database and we can fetch the data by ID, or we can find all the data from the database, right? So we'll make a endpoint as we are getting the data. So this would be a get mapping, not the post mapping, as we are not posting it, right? So it is get mapping, and I would say get employee data, employee by ID, right? And we will say method as public, and we'll be returning optional. So we'll be returning an optional, and I'll tell you that why we are returning an optional. So employee. So let's say that I said get employee by ID, right? And here we need the ID as an input. So we'll say request body employee emp. Why I am saying why I am taking the whole object and not the ID? Because we are working on JSON, right? I am assuming that we'll get input in JSON and I'll be giving output in JSON. So I'll be supplied whole employee object in JSON. So I'll have only ID in that JSON, right? So I'll be consuming that ID. So I'll say return repository, employee repository, as we have already made in the previous video, employee repository. So we'll say find by ID, and we'll supply as emp.getID. So simply why I've used optional is because the return type of find by ID is optional. And why it is optional? As if the employee table is blank and we don't have any data, then also we need to supply something to the user, right? A blank empty JSON would be supplied if the data is empty. If suppose I say that the return type of this method could be employee, if we don't have employee, then it would throw a null pointer exception, or maybe some exception that yes, the data is not been there. So for that we need to write our own code, right? Now we know that the find by ID returns optional as the return type, so we have defined that optional, right? So now I'll define another. So we said that we can do it by two ways, we can find data by two ways. So we will say get all employee, right? And I'll declare a method. As we don't need the here I would say employee, and we'll say get all employee. We don't need anything, just we don't need any input from the user, right? We have to supply all the data of employee table, so there is no input parameter, right? So we'll say return employee repo dot find all. Now what is the problem here is that find all returns an iterable object, right? There could be many employees, right? So that's why the declaration or the return type would be iterable. So it's iterable, and we'll say employee. So this would be the return type of this method, right? Why it is saying okay, I'll have to save the data. Okay, it is done now. So our find endpoints are being made, that is our read endpoints are already made. So we have completed C, we have completed R of the CRUD. Now comes the update part, how we will be updating the data. So first of all, we need the data would be supplied to us. The data that we need to update, the data would be supplied by the user first, and then we will be updating it, right? So we will be saying post mapping. So we will say public update employee, right? Update employee, and we have to give the mapping as update employee. So update employee, and I'll say it the particular employee that is being updated, right? So we will say that we will return that employee that we are asked to update. So now we need the input parameters as an employee entity emp, as the JSON would be supplied to us, and we'll update that JSON, right? Take it that way. So now first of all, we need to find that if the data exists or not. So we'll be using this method employee repository dot find by id. So we'll say as this returns an optional, so we'll say optional employee emps equals employee repo dot find by id, right? So this will return us an optional object. So the object exists, so now we have to update that particular object. So we'll say for example, I'll update the designation of the employee, right? So I have made an emps dot get, as it is an optional return type, so we need to get first the object of employee, and then we'll say set designation, and we will say emp dot get designation. So now we have to update it, so we will simply return the object by saying employee repository dot save, and we'll be saving this new object that we have declared emps, right? So it will return the object that is being that the new entries. So okay, we wanted to return the updated employee object, so we have updated the employee object, and then we have saved that updated object to our database. So it will return the updated employee object, right? Now as for the CRUD operation, see that is create is already been done, we have saved the data. Then goes R, that is read, we have already found out the data, we have found the data from the database. We have made two endpoints to find the data, and then the third, that is U, that is update. So we have updated the data. Now the last one is that we need to delete the data, right? So we'll say post mapping, and we'll say delete, simply delete, and I would say public, as the delete method has a return type void. So to the user that has been hitting our endpoint, we should actually tell that user that okay, the id which you have supplied, we have deleted that id. So we need to actually make our own return type and we need to supply that return type, right? So we'll say response entity of object, right? So I'll be making a method to actually generate the output as response entity. So I'll say response entity of object and we'll say delete data by id. So I'm using it by id, so we'll be requiring the input from the user as well. So we need request body and we'll say employee emp. Okay, so now what we'll do it, we'll simply call the repository and we'll say dot delete by id and we'll pass emp dot get id. So we just need id as an input from the user and we are done. We'll delete the data. Now as we are returning some response, that is response entity, so we need some conditions that okay, the object is deleted or not. So we can do it by simply saying that okay, we'll find that data from our database and if we get that data, we will say that the particular data for that id is not deleted, else it is deleted. So we'll say if emps dot is present, then we'll say return the data is there. I'll construct the output as it will say the output type is not matching. So I'll say else return deleted the data, right? Deleted the data by that id. So now I'll make an output, the output that we want to generate from this method and tell the user that okay, we have deleted your object with that particular id. So I'll say public and the return type would be response entity object. So I will say generate response. So I am writing this as a generic method, right? Generate response and I'll I'll be saying that okay, I'll be supplying a message to the user. So I'll say string message, then I'll be supplying the status of the call, that would be http status, right? So I'll say st and then the object which is being supplied to us, so that object would be response object, right? So this method comes and we'll say the response, we'll say simply we'll construct a map of string and object, that is map of string and object, that is map equals new hash map, simply hash map. Okay, so now we have to put all the things that we are supplying to this method in this map. So map dot put and the key is the message and the value is message, right? Now map dot put, so map dot put, the key is status and the value is st dot value, right? The int value, right? Now map dot put, the last thing is the object. So we'll say it as data and we'll supply as response object, right? And now we need the return type as response entity, so we'll say return and we'll return new response entity, that is object type, and we'll say simply pass map comma st. Okay, so it will return the response as response entity. Now I'll consume this method here, so I'll say generate response. So I'm telling you this because this could be a generic method, and we can use this method in all other methods as well to give a output that suits the user, right? We can ask the user that what output has been required, and we can generate that output accordingly. So the message is if the object is present, so we'll say the object, the employee is not deleted, right? And the status is, I am saying the status as bad request. You can supply anything else as well. So the object is emp, right? So emp was our object, and if the data is being deleted, so we'll say generate response, and message would be the employee deleted with id as, we can say plus emp dot get id, and the status would be http status dot okay, right? The response would be 200, so we are saying okay, right? So the object would be emp. So now the return type is also done, so let's save it. Why it is saying that there is an error, change it to delete all. Oh sorry, I have used delete all by id, so we need to use delete by id, right? So we have delete by id. I'll say delete by id. So now all endpoints are made, and why it is showing an error? Okay, semicolon is missing, syntax error, no problem. Okay, so now all endpoints are being made. Now one catch that I want to tell you is that, okay, now I am using in my repository, I am using CRUD repository and not the JPA repository that I mentioned in the previous video. So why is that so? Because look, JPA repository is an external repository. It actually points your repository to JPA persistence technology, and the best practice is that we should avoid that. We can use CRUD repository for that. Basically JPA repository is used where we actually need sorting and pagination from our data, right? And if we don't require sorting and pagination, we can use CRUD repository. There is another repository that is paging and sorting repository that works same as CRUD repository but also provides paging and sorting. So we should actually go for CRUD repository. I mentioned in the previous video that I used JPA repository, but the better practice would be we should use CRUD repository. And if there is more of an interest to understand these repository hierarchy, I'll make a separate video on that. Do comment down below. So our application is ready, so I'll run the application first and we'll see that our tables are being made or not. So I'll run the application. Let me start the application. Logs are there. Yes, it has started to come, and okay, it is going good. So Hibernate queries would be fired now to create the tables in the database and the sequence. and the application has started. Okay, so now let's go to the database and check that the tables are created or not. So let's go to the public schema and we'll check in the table section the tables are created or not. So it is getting refreshed and employee table is being created. So let's go to the Postman and hit the records. We'll check that our endpoints are working or not. So we'll say save employee, right? And the body is right, Ramanpreet Singh, and designation is software engineer 2A. So I'll say send. So it saves the data. Yes, it saves the data and it says that the ID is 1 and name is Ramanpreet Singh and designation is software engineer 2A. So let me save another object. So I would say Rakesh Tiwari and he's a network engineer. Okay, so I'll say network engineer. So let's send this as well. So it stores this data as well with the ID too. So now we have to find the data by ID. Okay, so I'll go to get employee by ID. So we have this as get request, right? But we have to supply ID to it, right? So I am finding data for ID 2. So I'll send it and check that the data is coming or not. Yes, the data is coming. It is saying the ID is 2, name is Rakesh Tiwari and designation is network engineer. So now we have to test another endpoint, that is get all employees. So I have that endpoint as well. But now in this endpoint we don't need to supply anything, so we don't need any body, right? So you can say that body could be set to none. So you will say get all employees and we will send it. The JSON list should be printed. Yes, the JSON list is being printed. So ID 1 Ramanpreet Singh, ID 2 Rakesh Tiwari, network engineer. Right, now we have done with the find. So we will say update now. So we have to update it, right? So it's our post request. So let's go to the body and we say ID is 1 and update him as a software engineer 2B, right? And we'll send it, right? So it should get updated. Yes, the ID is 1 and software Ramanpreet Singh and the designation is software engineer 2B. We have sent 2B, right? It was first 2A, right? So I have updated it from 2A to 2B. So now is that we need to delete the data, right? So updation is being done. So let's delete the data. So the endpoint for deletion was, let's go to the controller and check that what was the endpoint for the deletion. It was /delete and we need to pass the ID here, right? So we say /delete and I'll say that the ID that I want to delete is 2, right? So Rakesh Tiwari data would get deleted. So I'll say send. So look, now a very formulated kind of a response is being given to the user. If I would have actually not sent any response, because delete doesn't give you any response, delete by ID doesn't give you any response, it's a void return type. So the user won't have any idea that the data is being deleted or not. So now very formulated kind of an output is being given, that the request status is 200 and the data ID was 2 that was supplied, and message is the employee deleted with ID 2, right? So now endpoints are already tested. So we are done with the goal for this video. So in this is for actually the CRUD application is also completed. I have previously made videos on database connection and a hello world. So do check the series of Spring Boot and get a full idea. In future I'll be coming up with some idea based projects and I'll be coding in front of you like I did today. So do share this video and give your queries or feedbacks in the comment section, and do subscribe the channel and share this channel and grow this channel. So thank you. I'll get back to you soon.